welcome to the South Asia Institute at Columbia. And you're joining us today for our ongoing Monday afternoon speaker series. And today's talk is the second in a series on state power, violence, and everyday life in South Asia. My name is Debashree Mukherjee, and I'm just temporarily filling in as moderator for today on behalf of the South Asia Institute's director, Dr. Catherine Ewing. What I would suggest is, for those of you that are new to the South Asia Institute, we are continuing a few more in our online series as the campus reconfigures a return to in-person events. So you might want to take a look at some of our upcoming events. I've just posted a calendar of exciting programming that's coming up. But today I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Jinee Lokaneeta, who will be presenting a talk titled State Violence in Democracies, Torture, Policing, and Scientific Interrogations in India. Dr. Lokaneeta is chair and professor in political science and international relations at Drew University in New Jersey. Her areas of interest include law and violence, critical political and legal theory, human rights, and interdisciplinary legal studies. Dr. Lokaneeta has taught at institutions both in India and the United States, including at the National Law University in Delhi and Delhi University. Her first book, titled Transnational Torture, Law, Violence, and State Power in the United States and India, was published in 2011. And in many ways, her recent second book, right here, is continues the investigation that she began in the first book, focusing now on the technical and the pseudo-scientific methods used to extract confessional truths from the accused, a turn to what she terms truth machines that are hailed by many as a paradigm shift away from physical torture. And Dr. Lokaneeta will tell us more about what that shift actually means. Today's talk will draw on this book. The book is titled The Truth Machines, Policing, Violence, and Scientific Interrogations in India. And it has won the C. Herman Pritchett Award from the Law and Court section of the American Political Science Association. Congratulations, Jinee. It's also a truly fantastic book. It is not only urgent and timely, but also very inventive and conceptually very rewarding. And it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome you to the South Asia Institute today. So I will hand over to you now. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen just so that we can get that going. Can you see it, Debbie? Okay, thank you so much. So thanks to Professor Cathy Ewing, who had originally gotten in touch with me from the South Asia Institute, Columbia, for inviting me to speak, and to Bill Carrick for all the logistics. It gives me particular pleasure to speak at this forum, since in addition to the engagement with scholarship and friends at this institution, including our moderator for today, Professor Debashree Mukherjee, whose wonderful scholarship I greatly admire. Large parts of this book from which today's talk is drawn was actually written in Butler Library as a part of the New York Public Library Mali program that has actually enabled one access to this space and its materials. So I really wanted to start by acknowledging that. In August 2021, the current Chief Justice of the Indian Supreme Court, Ramana, said in a very important effort to ensure a right to legal aid, quote, "The threat to human rights and bodily integrity are the highest in police stations. In spite of constitutional declarations and guarantees, lack of effective legal representation at the police stations is a huge detriment to arrested or detained persons. To keep police excesses in check, dissemination of information about the constitutional right to legal aid and availability of free legal services is necessary," end quote. And undoubtedly, the problem of custodial torture and deaths has been a prevalent one all through post-independent India, as also in colonial India. As I'll argue today, custodial torture cannot just be addressed by focusing on the police or on noting colonial continuities, since the primary statutes, of course, governing Indian criminal justice system, including the Police Act, continue from British colonial times, nor is it a question of just ensuring rights such as legal aid, although all of these are important to consider. Rather, as I point out in my recent book, The Truth Machines, the Indian Supreme Court's inadequate jurisprudence, the role of actors, including and beyond the police, to magistrates, and even to semi-state actors such as forensic psychologists and medical professionals, and indeed the entire state development model of modernization may be important to consider to understand torture, or as my broader theoretical framework indicates, the relationship between state power and legal violence in liberal democracies. And I put forward the concept of contingent state to conceptualize this relationship. My research has focused generally on the relationship between law, violence, and state power in liberal democracies. In my first book, Transnational Torture, focusing on India and US, I traced how jurisprudence that is considered the most legitimate state discourse formally condemns torture, yet ends up accommodating excess violence. In that work, I primarily focused on analyzing legal cases from both India and the US in the post 9/11 context. I also analyzed reports and cultural representations of torture in TV shows like 24 to intervene in a debate on whether torture was an exception in liberal democracies, and argued that excess violence was very much a part of the governing in liberal democracies. In The Truth Machines, then I shift from jurisprudence to also examine more closely state actors who are responsible for interpreting and implementing the laws and safeguards against torture. Let me start with just a very brief overview of what the Indian state's problem with custodial torture is in terms of numbers. We actually don't have statistics on number of torture cases in India, though we have numerous reports. But we do have numbers on custodial deaths. For instance, the annual report on torture in India 2020, brought out by the National Campaign Against Torture, noted that between April 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020, about 113 people died in police custody and 1569 in judicial custody, as reported by the Ministry of Home Affairs. The report notes in its 2021 report that there were 111 deaths in 2020 alone. Thus, custodial deaths in India continued despite the strict lockdown during the pandemic. Torture in India is prevalent in distinct contexts. As human rights scholar, activist Gautam Navlakha, who's currently in jail, had once helped me systematically understand in an interview. I present in my attempt to think of the numerous sites by extending the metaphor of the torture tree that Lawrence Ralph has utilized in his path-breaking work on torture against Blacks and other minorities in Chicago in his book, Torture Letters. Torture tree for Ralph refers to the trunk representing mistreatment, harassment, torture, and death from the system of law and order that disproportionately impacts Blacks as compared to whites. And the branches were really the police and military who committed those acts. The leaves are the everyday acts of police, while the roots are an investment in fear in maintaining the racial caste system. Taking some liberty in modifying it in the Indian context, I would say that understanding the torture tree would help us reveal the different sites and hierarchies to be maintained. In India, in routine cases, it is evident in the numerous custodial deaths that continue to occur even in theft or dispute cases. Think, for instance, the new Tamil film Jai Bhim, that apparently has surpassed Shawshank Redemption in its high ratings as well, where Raj Kannu and his relatives from the Irula tribe were brutally tortured in custody in a false case of theft. The case is, of course, really about how tribal, caste, class, and gender identities and assumption of habitual offenders form the experience with police. Second is the context of terrorism and organized crime cases facilitated by extraordinary laws. Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Act, Prevention of Terrorism Act, Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act earlier, and now Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that routinely evade safeguards against extended detention and delay in bail, and often target Muslim bodies. Third, in the context of Kashmir, parts of the Northeast and Punjab previously, where torture, detention, and disappearances are common because those who commit these crimes have virtual impunity even as habeas petitions are denied. One can now start adding a fourth category, which doesn't neatly fit in the categories earlier, that of targeting human rights activists and of foreclosing dissent. The refusal to give bail to vulnerable prisoners, despite an inability to avoid overcrowding during a pandemic, or putting them in an anda or egg-shaped cell to punish them, or to just use detention as punishment against dissenters, as the denial of bail for Umar Khalid, a scholar activist, also makes these conditions inhuman and torturous. In all these contexts, victims of torture and custodial deaths are predominantly from poorer and marginalized groups, including tribal, Dalit, women, and minorities, particularly Muslims, and as I noted earlier, those who dissent, though it could potentially extend to others. To give a recent example, on November 8th, 2021, there was a custodial death of a Muslim youth, Altaf, and the shocking video of a police officer claiming that Altaf committed suicide in custody in Kasganj, UP, by using a string of a jacket to hang himself on a 2.5 feet water pipe. Despite numerous fact-finding reports by the People's Union for Democratic Rights about custodial torture and deaths, the category of illnesses and suicides dominate the official explanation of custodial deaths. As you can see in this chart I put together from National Crimes Research Bureau data. And this helps elide the relationship of torture and custodial deaths. So if these are the contexts in which torture exists, the puzzle in my book, The Truth Machines, that I started off with is why in a context where torture exists with such impunity and officials rarely convicted or charged, partly because of an absence of a specific law against torture and non-ratification of the UN Convention Against Torture, a discourse on truth machines to replace physical torture appeared. And how does it help understand the relationship between state power and legal violence in liberal democracies? In addition to focusing on legal cases, reports, political discourses, and popular representations, I conducted interviews with police, forensic psychologists, lawyers, and activists in 5 cities, Delhi, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Gandhinagar, visiting forensic science labs in these cities to understand the relationship between law, science, and policing. I focused on the emergence of 3 scientific techniques that I termed truth machines: narco analysis, brain scans, and lie detectors. Very briefly, narco analysis is the injecting of sodium pentothal for inducing confessions or information, popularly known as the truth serum. The second is brain fingerprinting and its Indian version, brain electrical oscillation signature test, that supposedly captures experiential participation in a crime through an electroencephalogram, and lie detectors that measure physiological indicators. My focus is to study and understand the everyday practices of the state, not captured by more monolithic conceptions of the state. whether it's a more Weberian, bureaucratic conception of monopoly over legitimate violence constrained by rules, or a more Agamben-inspired understanding of a sovereign state's violence over bare life. Here I draw more from the anthropologists of the state, such as Veena Das and Akhil Gupta and others, and adopt a more ethnographic sensibility. I put forward the idea of a contingent state, which refers to the way states constantly oscillate between the desire to be unitary and the inability to do so under certain conditions. The concept of contingent state points to the continually negotiated nature of the relationship between state power and legal violence. For instance, if we just see the emergence of these techniques, it's both a story of a disaggregated arbitrariness on one hand and state intentionality on the other. There's often an assumption of clear intentionality in state techniques. Think of changes in methods of executions in the US, from hanging to lethal injections, as Austin Surratt writes about, or from scarring to non-scarring torture techniques, as Darius Rejali notes. But interviews with the Indian police and forensic psychologists suggest the contingent emergence and use of these techniques. The rise of these particular truth machines in India were actually the result of clear contingencies. Ambitious forensic psychologists in forensic science labs in Gandhinagar and Bangalore wanting to gain visibility, legally and in public, that led to popularization of these techniques. At some point, the truth machines also fitted the post-colonial state's desire to appear as using scientific and modern techniques, in part due to the critique of the human rights movement that was consolidating in the 1980s and 90s. It was primarily after the 1975 to 77 when there was an emergency declared by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi due to internal disturbances and wide-scale torture and detention took place during this time, that there was a consolidation of the human rights movement post-emergency to focus on protection of human rights. And one of the major issues was how to deal with the question of custodial torture and deaths, particularly of political prisoners, though over time on custodial deaths and torture more generally. Groups such as PUDR and PUCL and the Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee and international NGOs like Amnesty focused on these questions. And both due to internal and external pressures, India set up a National Human Rights Commission that focused on custodial deaths. The 1990s also became a period when Supreme Court jurisprudence on torture, like the D.K. Basu case, emerged, which used an expanded notion of due process, using Article 21 of the Indian Constitution to acknowledge the pervasiveness of torture. The court, for instance, created safeguards such as an arrest or custody memo to involve the family or public as a witness to the arrest. Since illegal detention is fairly common enabling torture, the court also notes the need for a pre-trial right to a lawyer and regular medical exams, and the court has periodically focused on the implementation of the safeguards as well. So when I trace the emergence and consolidation of the techniques, though lie detectors existed earlier, it was only in the 1990s that these techniques collectively emerged, and one of the primary reasons for its ascendance was that there was a claim of these techniques replacing physical torture. As a retired police officer in Bangalore put it, I quote, "When I and others joined the police department, there was no narco analysis, or such things were unheard of. Only third degree and torturing of criminals was the method that was being used, which is not legal. Narco analysis came, human rights came. We had to use very patient methods, very slow detection. Breakthrough took some time," end quote. I suggest that it is in the 1990s, 2000s that the aspirations of individual forensic psychologists seem to merge with the need of the postcolonial state to use science and expertise to find technical solutions for police torture. In some ways, it is similar to what Timothy Mitchell calls the technopolitics in the context of Egypt, an alloy of non-human and human, or what I called an attempt on the part of the primarily female forensic psychologist to be a cyborg of sorts, a combination of scientific techniques and use of therapeutic art to be distinguished from the brutal police. The ills of the Indian criminal justice were to be addressed by the developmentalist state to create a state forensic architecture with machines and experts, with no regard for reliability or validity of these techniques or their coercive aspects. Thus, the state's modernization paradigm welcomed these techniques as crucial for police reform. In fact, the state high courts in mid-2000s that considered the constitutionality of these techniques basically upheld the techniques as replacing physical torture by involving medics and as a natural extension of the investigation, considered safe as they represented modernization similar to other life-saving machines like MRI. In the state of Andhra Pradesh versus Inapuri Padma and others, for instance, the court notes, I quote, in the accusations made in India, the police are attributed with applying third-degree methods in eliciting information. And there are instances of the culprits or suspects dying in lockups during the course of interrogation on account of application of third-degree methods. Therefore, there's a blame that the Indian police are flagrantly violating the human rights. Therefore, there's every need to apply scientific tests to elicit the information from the culprits, end quote. The truth machines were only available in very few labs, though my interviews revealed that there was initially a plan to build a huge network of these truth machines, even at the district levels, with mobile forensic science labs, and was a developmental priority for the Indian state. The Supreme Court, even when it intervened in 2010, while unequivocally ruling out the involuntary use of the techniques, focused mostly on consent and inadmissibility of evidence as a result of these techniques, though allowed for exceptions in terms of admissibility. In the process, even the highest court doesn't question the paradigm itself of using questionable science, of allowing medical professionals who had played an uneven role against torture in the past, and doesn't completely challenge conditions of police custody or remand, often seen as synonymous with torture. It is also important to note that both lie detectors and narcoanalysis or truth serums have a long history in the US, whether for Dr. Robert House, who popularized narcoanalysis through experiments with prisoners as a way to deal with the physical third degree in the 1920s or 30s, though there was also an attempt to see whether it could be used for interrogations by the scientific crime detection laboratory until that interest faded. The CIA picked it up during the Cold War, and narcoanalysis was also considered briefly in the post-9/11 context, though never really approved. There's a continued fascination about the techniques, with brain fingerprinting as a more recent innovation, even as their reliability and validity was always in doubt, especially for legal purposes. Yet in the US, at least, the persistence often remains in the realm of the popular than necessarily legal. And I trace that history in the US in my book in terms of the cultural production of these techniques that sustains fascination in them. In the Indian context, the truth machines, of course, didn't actually replace physical torture because they got used in very few cases, are themselves coercive, and they often got used alongside physical torture for terrorism-related cases in order to get particular answers. Let me explain with the help of the Mumbai blast case. On July 11, 2006, 7 bombings occurred on local trains in Mumbai. 189 people were killed and over 800 injured. Once the anti-terrorism squad Mumbai took over, 13 Muslim men were charged with the crime, having been charged under the Indian Penal Code as well as under two extraordinary laws, the 1967 Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the 1999 Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act. And in 2015, 12 of them were convicted and one acquitted. All the accused were reportedly tortured, and 12 of them confessed. Methods of torture included electric shocks and beatings with a flour mill belt. As one recounted, the police started beating me by flour mill belts and sticks on my palms and soles. I was tied by rope and given electric shocks to my private parts, similar to the black box that Lawrence Ralph mentions in his account of police torture in Chicago. Other methods in the Indian context included stripping men naked, putting them in stress positions, beating the palms of their hands and feet, and forcing them to sit with their feet at 180 degrees. One detainee mentioned the injecting of liquid chemicals through the anus. A torture room of the anti-terrorism squad figures centrally in these narratives. Other methods of instilling fear were threats of torture, detention, and extrajudicial killing, together with the targeting of family members, including the threat of rape for women. Family members might be brought to the station to be harassed and insulted, and occasionally also subjected to stripping and beating. Narco analysis played a prominent role in the Mumbai blast case and draws our attention to what I call the semi-state actors. The concept of contingent state I propose in the book, as opposed to a unitary or exceptional state, helps us think about the role of other actors involved in policing, namely the forensic psychologists who claim that they are different from the police and provide therapy as an extension of the machine. As one psychologist said, while torture is an external stimuli, these techniques are internal ones and invite an internal journey. They force you to review your past in a different way, not confess, but ask them to think about themselves and come back. It is a moment of catharsis in the legal system. Unlike the police custody, where there's fear of encounter or custodial death or torture, here there is empathy, end quote. In the Mumbai blast case of 2006, Abdul Wahid Sheikh, the only one acquitted, and author of an incredibly stringent critique of the Indian criminal justice system, Beguna Kaidi or Innocent Prisoners, which has now been translated into English from Hindi and Urdu and must be read, also initially believed that the truth machines conducted by the doctors would reveal the truth about his innocence until he realized it wasn't to be. The psychologists even claim that the techniques won't actually work if the persons are physically or psychologically harmed, gesturing to a shift in the mode of interrogations. But then, of course, they end up creating the same conditions in labs and hospitals that prop up physical torture by utilizing these coercive machines to get confessions involuntarily, and therefore need to be squarely rejected. Yet the management of this violence and the actors beyond the police are important to recognize in their disaggregated and multifaceted form. Why were the truth machines a problem? Medical ethics scholar and activist Amar Jesani characterizes narco analysis as a form of pharmacological torture. Torture, in fact, remains torture, even if it does not spill blood, break bones, and is done in sterile, air-conditioned operation theaters, he writes. Similarly, PUDR noted, narco analysis negates protections by making redundant the right to silence of the subject. And this is even ignoring the fact that there's no scientific reliability and validity for these tests at all. The possibility of manipulation in narco analysis are tremendous. In the Mumbai blast case, the accused insisted that they were forcibly asked to consent to narco analysis. Consent in custody thus becomes a charged concept, as one account demonstrates. Dr. Malini, one of the most infamous forensic psychologists in Bangalore, misbehaved and slapped with me twice before the test. They asked me to say something before a video camera and beat me before asking me to say the sentences. She threatened that if I do not give correct answers, she would give me AIDS injection. I became semi-conscious after the injection of narco test was given. She asked illogical questions to me during this condition. The camera was switched on and first she asked, how many bombs were prepared? I answered that I'm not concerned and I'm falsely involved. She slapped me strongly and started pinching my left ear with pliers, because of which I suffered much. She then asked me what comes after 6, and I answered 7. She asked me on what TV operates, and I answered that it operates on electricity. She again slapped me strongly and caught my ear with pliers and told me to say, by remote. She asked me many such illogical questions and used to ask me to repeat the answers if I did not give the expected answers. Both tortured me badly during the narco test, end quote. This instance appeared to violate even the self-proclaimed standards for narcoanalysis by state officials, to be conducted safely in a hospital or a forensic lab. Pliers were reportedly used during the procedure, illogical questions were asked, and specified answers demanded. Each test concluded with an interrogator's insistence for a signature on a tailored confession. The deposition in these cases thus undermine any claim of replacing torture with narcoanalysis and police with forensic psychologists, and how merely ensuring consent may not mean much. The simultaneity of torture and truth machines is important here. Torture leads to a confession that must be recreated through a non-physical scientific technique. CDs for narcoanalysis sessions were edited to suit the police narrative. As a lawyer described the account of one of the accused, they played the CD of the narco test to me, and I was shocked to see that in place of my reply to the question as to how many bombs were prepared, the reply was 7. Anyone could see that the CD was edited because the words were not in sync with the video. As Sheikh warns in his book, suspects should never answer in the negative because their responses could be manipulated to appear as if they were answering other questions. The video camera thus becomes a means for generating public confessions. So when one thinks of the link between these truth machines to torture, it's not just that these techniques are coercive, but also in the fact that they were used to legitimize the shift in physical torture as a way for a democracy to show its commitment to rule of law or dealing with torture, even as it was never replaced and merely created another site for extraction of confessions, this time with the help of science and experts, which fits the modernizing narrative, the civilizational discourse that all liberal states claim and postcolonial states in particular strive for. The notion of the contingent state thus helps both capture the experience of those impacted by the violence, but that also has points of intersections with the police accounts in terms of what creates a possibility of resistance or break from within the state violence. Sheikh reveals what the police are constrained by, a dead body in custody. I quote, लेकिन याद रखिए पुलिस आपको टॉर्चर से मार नहीं डालेगी, वो तो केवल इतना मारेगी कि आप डर कर उसका काम कर दें, वो इस तरह नहीं मारेगी जिससे गहरे जख्म हो, इसलिए पूरी कोशिश करें कि कैमरा के सामने कोई बयान न दें. But you should remember that the police will not kill you with the torture. They will only beat you to the extent that you agree to do their work. The police won't beat you in such a way that there are physical wounds. So try your best not to give a statement in front of a camera. This sentiment is echoed by a police officer in a training academy who connected the human rights movement, the National Human Rights Commission, and the DK Basu, the significant Supreme Court case. These, he believed, collectively made the police much more nervous about deaths in custody. I quote, the suspect's safety is in your custody. You don't want him to die. So you take care of him, your brother. You're scared of death, end quote. Often the Indian police is understood mostly as either colonial continuity, as Heath and Kumar more recently show, or inspired by the more Marxist or critical conceptions, police as seen as the repressive institutions of the state, therefore not requiring much scrutiny on their own. But these insights are less revealed in my interviews, and in this limited sense, drawing from new police studies scholars, I term it the pastoral role of the police mediating the coercive. I point to how studying the police as a site of state power in the everyday sense allows for an access into the structural constraints of the police, but above all reveal, in their own words, the pragmatic logic of why third degree continues. It is the fear of the custodial death that has allowed for the mediation of the coercive with the pastoral. The emergence of these truth machines thus helps one understand the vacillations of the contingent state and whether there are shifts and cracks possible in both the narratives and practices of the state that have life and death consequences for those who experience state violence. Here, I also want to note the role of the magistrates and doctors in the case required by law to ensure protections against torture. The magistrates in front of whom these men were produced rarely inquired into their cases. Before each hearing, the accused were threatened not to reveal their experiences. As one detainee noted, the police threatened that if we complain about beating and torture, they would involve our family members in the case and would torture us more. Therefore, I did not say anything before the judge because of the fear. If they protested, the accused were tortured again. One had an infected ear from the use of pliers, but he was warned not to complain or the torture would be even more brutal. One detainee described waterboarding. A wet cloth was put on my face because of which I was not able to breathe. They had an apparatus with them, by which probably they were measuring my blood pressure, and after a certain level was reached, they used to remove the cloth, end quote. Only when he agreed to confess did the torture stop. He was then given some ointments or taken to the hospital where he was warned not to complain to the doctor. Only occasionally, he recalled, would a magistrate ask for a medical exam. But doctors overlooked his injuries even when they were aware of severe torture. Before a court hearing, suspects might be allowed to sleep so that they did not appear tortured in front of the magistrate. As one accused explained, I was taken for medical checkup many times during police custody, but was not physically checked by the doctors, not allowed to speak with the doctors. The veil was not removed at any time, but only my thumb impressions were taken. After his brothers also tortured, another of the accused realized that the documents he was forced to sign involved recovery of admissible evidence. The body must provide oral proof. Doctors and magistrates who are by law charged with ensuring the veracity of procedures thus fail to challenge the forcible extraction. As a lawyer in another terrorism-related case said, so my question is, how come the judiciary, how come those magistrates who remanded these boys without complying with that mandatory requirement of the Supreme Court, how come disciplinary action was not taken against them? In the absence of action against judges who convict on flimsy evidence or magistrates who fail to follow safeguards against torture, this lawyer noted. Otherwise, what is the message I get as a Muslim? They were able to play football with your life, your career, your human rights, and this, damn all that you can do. And what's the message judges will get? Play whatever games you can, you are immune. Each step in the procedure must be followed, even as it's substantively undermined. Even under Makoka, used in the Mumbai case, a confession must be voluntary. The Deputy Commissioner of Police must warn the accused without police pressure about the right to silence and then ask to repeat the confession in front of a magistrate who ensures a medical examination outside police custody. All these measures ostensibly ensure that a suspect confessed voluntarily and not due to torture or pressure. But in practice, each step becomes little more than a bureaucratic check mark, indicative more of a scaffolding than ensuring the rights of the accused. Rather than revealing the violence, these state and semi-state actors mask the violence through these bureaucratic check marks. The procedures are technically followed, thereby preserving what I term the scaffold of the rule of law, and ends up invisibilizing the state violence. Ultimately, the scaffolding keeps these elements of the system in place, providing a facade of a rational bureaucratic system. For Foucault, who writes of the spectacle of the scaffold through public execution and torture confirmed the truth of the crime in public. The scaffold of the rule of law, I argue, however, ensures the truth of the crime in public through procedures meant to avoid the theatrical production of torture by masking it. Thus, when the definition of the rule of law primarily focuses on formal procedural safeguards and judiciary's role in protecting individual rights, the violence within is hidden. The detainee narratives thus help reveal the violence and also challenge those who keep it in place. When we focus just on the police, we fail to notice how the scaffold of the rule of law is created collectively by police, magistrates, and doctors and forensic psychologists. And it is this realization of the role of other state and semi-state actors in protecting somebody in custody from torture that has led me to my current project. Article 22(2) of the Indian Constitution states, every person who is arrested and detained in custody shall be produced before the nearest magistrate within a period of 24 hours of such arrest, excluding the time necessary for the journey from the place of arrest to the court of the magistrate, and no such person shall be detained in custody beyond the said period without the authority of a magistrate. The focus of my new project is on the temporalities of justice represented by the custodial safeguards the moment a person steps into police custody and the limits therein. Rather than considering justice as being the end point of a process of investigation, or after a person has been subject of custodial violence, it examines the first point of interaction between the state and the citizen in custody. I argue that right to citizenship in a liberal democracy must directly focus on ensuring human life and dignity in custody, especially in the first few hours of custody, an issue that is inadequately addressed by scholarship, courts, and movements alike. The very conditions of custody mean that the experience of time is transformed for the detainee. The police often hold people on detention without a formal arrest or without legal authority. In such cases, one might argue that custodial temporality is undocumented. Hence, documented and undocumented temporality both become important point of analysis. Through a study of primary materials and an ethnographic study of judicial magistrate courts in 2 cities alongside interviews, I focus on this need to rethink citizenship through justice for custodial violence. Temporal injustices are visible in that only particular sections of society, Dalits, Adivasis, women, Muslims, among others, make up the bulk of the present population in India and may face state violence disproportionately. Since custodial violence disproportionately impacts the marginalized, the emphasis will be on capturing the subjective position of Dalits, Muslims, women, and other marginal figures from the custodial space that they are most dehumanized and erased. Drawing attention to the first point of custodial interaction, where these hierarchies determine lives and deaths, will help me understand how temporalities of justice in custody is linked to citizenship today. The significance of this project is reflected in the fact that the National Crimes Research Bureau's Crimes in India data collated by Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative suggests that almost 63% of custodial deaths between 2010 to 2020 took place before the person was produced in front of the magistrate. Thus, the state of detention in police custody is an exceedingly important side, but is an inadequately focused aspect of studies of custodial violence policing, and indeed the criminal justice system. In conclusion, my work focuses specifically on the constantly negotiated relationship between state power and legal violence as central to our study of police and state. The notion of the contingent state thus accounts for the need to study the distinct sites, actors, mechanisms, and experiences of and resistance to state violence, to note the shifts, cracks, and possibilities of transformation. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jinee. What we're going to do now is, it's a small enough group. I will invite you, especially if you're known to Jinee, to please turn your video on so that we can have a slightly convivial seminar room kind of a setting. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'm happy to jump in to just get the conversation started. So, so I already see some hands. I'm just going to jump in first. I'm really glad before we all met, I asked Jinee if this was the second book as part of a trilogy, and is there a third part in the offing? And I'm really excited about the temporalities of justice question. So just to get the ball rolling, one of my observations was, in terms of the sources that you look at, right? It's quite a mixed bag of methods. And one of the important sites seems to be also narratives, memoirs, kind of autobiographical writings by detainees post, either writing in prison and sending accounts out through journalist friends, or writing posts. So for example, like Arun Ferreira's very important writing. And I was thinking, does that become a kind of dispersal of the confessional mode? And for me, that's an interesting question, because it allows us to think about if the forensic science kind of use and torture, right? You're saying that one of the problems with that is this confessional paradigm, as you say, is contiguous with physical torture. And if that's the kind of extraction of the confession as the kind of crystallization of truth, right, towards punishment, what is this other kind of genres that are also produced? Who do they address? Are they addressed to the state, right? If they're not addressed to the state, is there a different kind of an idea here, or a different imagination, again, of justice? Because one of the ideas here is, and you quote from Shuddhita Kaviraj, where he says, there is no end in sight of Indian society's strange enchantment with the modern state, right? So when we think of, say, even paperwork, right, hanging on to every document to prove citizenship, the addressee is always the state that will recognize you, give you the rights, and then provide you justice. These narratives of torture experience and so on, do they address a slightly different entity? That's just me thinking in terms of genre. So I'll stop there. I have plenty of questions. I'll jump in again in a bit. Jinee, if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, should I respond? Yeah, okay. So thank you. First of all, it's so lovely to see many familiar faces, and thank you so much for taking the time to come. So one of the things that, I think I've sort of struggled with, right? And I think that is a big shift from my first book, where I mostly looked at legal cases and reports and documents and popular representations, right? That in a sense, in some ways, even as you're critiquing the state for not looking at the particularity of experience, in focusing on, the state narratives, you also end up in some ways not being able to highlight or engage with the narratives of those who are experiencing the state violence, right? So I did sort of feel, that while early on it felt really important for me to look at cases and reports and so on, right? It was also a recognition that in the last 10 years, you actually have a lot more, sort of proliferation, I think, of sort of memoirs and autobiographical, books that have come out, right? There always was some, but I would say that now it's much more, in terms of a whole genre of people who are writing not about the past, right? But really about the present, right? We are talking about Arun Ferreira, who, who's that was the first, right, round of his experience in jail, and he's still in jail, right? So there's a way in which, it is about the current moment. And so for me, I think what this particular genre represents is actually not so much sort of addressing the state, but rather, creating a kind of critical consciousness, right? And because we do see that, in some ways, a lot of what happened in prisons or custody was always sort of thought of as, something which is not known. I think Radha Kumar in her book, right, sort of also talks about the colonial state, sort of recognizing that what's happening in the realm of custody is never known, right? So there's a similar logic of that where, it is, I think, primarily about critical consciousness, although, of course, there's always a possibility of, in the process, revealing the inconsistencies of what the state claims, right? And what actually is experienced, and can then be echoed by the, various different narratives, right? Because there's also a way in which, if the state is not willing to accept what is happening in custody specifically, but it resonates across different sites, right? Or you see a kind of a confirmation of similar kinds of techniques, similar kind of experiences, then there is a contribution towards a critical consciousness. And I think that's another role that it's playing, and in that sense, it is striking that even, even though other memoirs have also got interest, but Beguna Kaidi has really, it's been translated. There's a film coming out on Abdul Wahid Sheikh's, experience and so on. So I think there is some kind of a resonance that it finds, just as Guantanamo Diary, right, by Slahi here was a New York Times bestseller.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question or a comment from Shekhar Ramakrishnan. Would you like to ask him?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just realized I had unmuted myself. I apologize. So Jinee, it was great to hear the talk, and I learned a lot. I have a bunch of questions. Could I just ask one at a time, because they're somewhat disparate? So a technical thing, I didn't follow the logic of illogical questions.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just say quickly?
Yeah. So, so they would basically say they were questions which were not linked to the case, for instance, right? So how does TV operate?
Right.
So those kinds of things, which, even if you were just thinking about, okay, this is regular interrogation, right?
Right.
There were always these questions that were meant to elicit a response, right? So you by remote, and then,
right.
You'd say no, by electricity or by remote, right? So that's what I meant by that.
So is the purpose there to get something recorded that they can then edit into something else, so that they can pretend that this answer was given to somebody? Or is it that something that happens routinely in lie detectors, where they ask these neutral questions to set baseline with which they compare response to specific questions. So
yeah, no, I think that's an interesting comparison. I think neither, I mean, in case of brain scans as well as lie detectors, they do have baseline kind of questions for both. But with narco analysis, it's very different, right? Because
okay.
basically you have this forensic psychologist who does many sessions with the person, and therefore it's more about trying to get particular answers, right?
Okay.
And I think in certain cases where, and this often happens in sort of terrorism related or more media sort of generated interest, right, on particular cases where there's already an assumption that you are guilty, right? So part
Sure.
of it is you are just trying to confirm that, right? And here, of course, these videos, they very clearly said that, oh, they were edited, right? You
Right.
could figure out, but then the part of the problem is that in many of these cases, the narco analysis report would only be in the form of a report by the forensic psychologist later,
Sure.
right? So that you're not looking at the hours and hours of footage in that context.
I have another very short question. You mentioned
Yeah.
women towards the end, and so is it that proportionately there are more women in custody, or is it just that their treatment is worse than the treatment received by men in custody?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of much more in terms of the nature of, right? So, for instance, you will find that, you would have tribal women in particular. So it can vary from state to state, right? But you would find intersecting identities, sort of really explaining why there may be more tribal women in Chhattisgarh, for instance, right? So you have to look at it state-wise. The other thing which I was thinking about was, during the pandemic, there was a lot of emphasis on sort of thinking about how pregnant women were treated. And initially,
Sure.
so I think it's both about the nature of the treatment, but I think you could also see that basically, when you look at intersectional identities, you would see women in terms of the proportion.
I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time, but I have my two major questions. One, I'm not at all familiar with the recent thing, and it was really fascinating and upsetting to see the number of deaths in custody ascribed to suicide and so-called illness in hospitals. But I was thinking back, like during the 70s, 80s, it seemed we read a lot about encounter killings. So have they been essentially replaced by these suicide illness deaths? Do the police now find it more convenient to kill people in custody rather than release them and then kill them on the outskirts of a village or wherever?
So this is again, so one of the things when we talk about, either police or prisons is also it varies a lot state-wise, right? And so one clear answer to you is to say that the numbers of, deaths in police custody and judicial custody throughout, let's say from the 1990s is when we have the first set of reports from National Human Rights Commission, till now have been fairly similar. So they've remained the same, right? And of course, but when you look at sort of the figures more closely, you will find that amazingly enough from certain states, which we know, right, that there are killings or particularly in conflict areas, you would find that there are very few cases that are mentioned. So, CHRI, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, has done a lot of work sort of questioning some of these data. But when you ask the question about encounters, right, which is what, in the Indian context, are what extrajudicial killings are called, fake encounters. UP, for instance, there was a very powerful report that came out last year, which showed that in the last few years, there have been a high number of extrajudicial killings.
Okay.
Right. And then we had that infamous one where, basically the people who were accused of rape in Hyderabad, they were like, extrajudicially killed, right, by the police. So I think I wouldn't necessarily sort of say that that's sort of replacing one or the other. I think extrajudicial killings remain a major part of, and there are cases still going on about what's happened in Manipur and sort of getting accountability for that. So it's always, I think important, particularly with state violence, to think about distinct sites and the challenges that each of these sites have. And at times you see some more visibility on one or the other.
So finally, Jinee, thanks for your patience. You mentioned 5 cities where you did your research. Were they chosen for convenience, or were there some very definite reason? And related to that, did you find differences in custodial practices, etc., say between Bengaluru and Gandhinagar and so on?
Yeah, no. So the main reason, particularly 3 of them were chosen, which was Bangalore, Gandhinagar, and Mumbai, was because these were the 3 labs which used all these 3 techniques.
Okay.
Right. And they were sort of really famous or infamous for the use of these techniques. Right.
Okay.
And in fact, it originated in Gujarat, and the same person had links and had trained people in Mumbai and also in, Bangalore. But also the same person had trained some people in Delhi and Hyderabad. So I was interested in sort of looking at, whether there was a difference. All 5 of them used lie detectors. There was that. But I was interested in sort of thinking about, what is the emphasis, right? In the 3 labs where these were prioritized and they were really strongly associated. And then 2 were sort of looking at whether there were different kinds of forensic techniques that were being emphasized in the other 2. And I would say that Gandhinagar was the most, and continues to be. Right now, it is sort of the, I think it's declared as the main forensic science university, which trains forensic psychologists, but also on other, techniques as well. It's sort of declared as a national university. And they are most invested in trying to create some of these investigators and forensic psychologists. I think both Mumbai and Bangalore have struggled to do so because of various reasons. And there are lots of stories of interpersonal, rivalries as well that come in.
Thank you so much, Jinee. Thank you.
Thanks, Shekhar. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll go straight to the next comment or question from Upanita.
Hi. Thanks, Debbie.
Hi,
Hi, Jinee. It's always such a pleasure listening to you. And thank you so much, as usual, for an amazing talk. I think my questions come from, tracing some of these similar themes in the colonial archives of British India, where I imagine some of these institutional blueprints and structures had kind of, emerged. And, in my research, one of the things that sort of keeps coming up is that, the hallmark of the Indian criminal justice system as it emerged during the colonial period was the fact that it was organized squarely under the aegis of the colonial government, rather than, sort of these efforts being left to the enterprise of private agents, which was in fact the case in England at the time. In 19th century England, most forensic practitioners would have like private practice, and were not in fact employed by the state. I think one of the fascinating things that your book traces is this sort of shift, is this very critical shift where a slew of private actors become involved in the operations and the everyday operations of the criminal justice system. In fact, the forensic sort of apparatus and the institutional complex that you describe so well in the book. I wondered if you might shed some light on, like how these private actors are accommodated within the criminal justice system. What kind of status do they have as experts? Because I imagine, the sort of statutory prescriptions would only be equipped to account for forensic experts who are also employed by the state. How are they sort of legally accounted for? And out of just curiosity, how do they present their evidence? Like, do they actually appear in court as expert witnesses, or do they just send in their report? If they are not in fact allowed to appear in court in person, is there an interest among these experts to sort of go to the court and give their like perform their expertise in an open trial? And I think related to that is the question of admissibility, which came up a couple of times in your talk. And I imagine, talking about evidence in a legal context, one simply cannot avoid the language of admissibility, which kind of completely suffuses the legal understanding of, what counts as evidence vis-a-vis just, like raw information. So if you could talk a little bit, perhaps more about, how this particular genre of evidence, if I may say, how does that sort of sit with existing prescriptions on like on legal admissibility of evidence? I mean, thanks again for a brilliant talk.
Thanks, Upanita, and it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thanks for these amazing questions. I think what was very interesting for me, and again, sort of made me very aware of how the state, the practices in one state may vary from the other, right? So I was very curious about, and I would ask these to all the forensic psychologists in different labs. So do who oversees the forensic science lab, right? That was a big question for me. I must say that I got very different answers in different states, right? Even though technically, so there is this central forensic science labs, right? So if you look online, to the extent that websites, tell you some of these things, right? Then there are the central forensic science labs and the state ones. And in some instances, they would really emphasize their autonomy, right? And in that context, they might say that, we connect with private agencies who can also, if we cannot do these particular techniques, we are able to go to this private, agency. But recognizing that some of those private agency people also actually worked sometimes in these state labs, right? So there's a very clear sort of relationship at times. In other instances, they would actually say that we are under the state government, right? And there is no autonomy. And so part of the reason why I end up not calling them non-state actors or private actors, but really the semi-state actors, right? And, I have been asked a lot about that category is precisely because of this, their unclear status, right? They are trying to work on behalf of the state, right? They very explicitly say that they want to get justice, right? They're a part of, the investigation process, in recognizing that, one of the reasons why we are still, just for a second, let me just remind us that, in the middle of the pandemic, the Delhi High Court wanted the Delhi government to set up a narco analysis facility and, and expand it, right? Because somehow or the other, right, there's still this fascination that whenever it's an unusual case, right? There was this, case of a judge who was hit in Dhanbad, I think, he was killed and in an auto and so on and so forth. They could not figure out what had happened. And the court wanted to look at the 6 or multiple narco analysis reports that had been done. That's how, somehow or the other, there is a fascination and need for that. And so therefore, the reason why I call them semi-state is because they're in the service of the state, but in order to claim their expertise, they have to show themselves also as distinct, right, from the police, who are really the investigators, right? Even if in practice, those distinctions have little meaning. We have evidence of videos where then you can hear somebody who's definitely the investigator, saying, pucho, pucho, ask them, so I think that there's, so I think which is why even when they are going to private agencies, I end up calling them semi-state actors, right? In the service of the state, I think. The second is they, one of the reasons they became so controversial, right? That you started having people write about it, right? Arun Ferreira was one of the first, Amajay Sani and others pointed to that. PUDR very quickly criticized these techniques, is because basically the forensic psychologists were feeling very marginalized in these forensic science labs, right? They were not given respect by other forensic scientists who said, what do? You don't do anything objective or scientific. We are the, objective science people, right? And so one of the things that the forensic psychologists started doing was to write in CBI journals, right? Basically talking about, what an incredible role forensic psychologists can play in this particular moment. And they would often say that, yes, it's true that DNA evidence and other kinds of evidence is important, but our investigative facilities are so bad, right? Our evidence gathering, practices are so messed up that actually at the end of it, your best bet is basically a forensic psychologist who can get information from a live suspect, right? So they really wanted that recognition, and so wanted to go to court, wanted their role to be acknowledged. And then ultimately, when this Bangalore person became very controversial, ended up also distancing themselves. The rest of them sort of said, okay, she's a, rogue forensic psychologist. You cannot judge all of us from what she did, right? So definitely, recognition was a part of it. And then very quickly about admissibility, I think part of it is, like I always had this reaction from lawyers for good reason, basically saying, okay, but now they can't do admissibility, so why be so concerned about this, right? But there are two things. One is this comes up at the level of the interrogation itself, right? Investigation, right? So you basically, don't even recognize how these confessions are produced, right? Even when physical torture is not used, right? It is being coercively produced when, in another site. And even if they are not ultimately, admitted, that's much later in the trial, right? So you can spend a lot of time, right? As we can see in many of the cases, that it can still be used to hold you, right? Or deny you bail and so on. So I think that's important. The other thing is, there's a cultural production of, right? Basically guilt and, innocence that we know. And that's one of the ways in which the narco analysis of Arushi's parents was emphasized by, Aviruk Sen, and in the film Talwar and so on, right? But also in the campaigns, basically to say, okay, the narco analysis showed that it may be the friends of Hemraj who may be involved, right? And at that point, it's not about what is only admitted in the court of law, but in the court of sort of popular opinion, right? So I think those are the ways in which admissibility needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to jump in for a second with basically a comment, because these are questions that I've been very interested in as someone who studies media, right? This kind of, what is the relation between the machinic from the truth machines and the question of truth? And this is a very, very old and also perhaps colonial modern question. We know the history from the story of bureaucracy. For example, photography, which actually predates fingerprinting, right? Which is quite surprising when people hear about that for the first time. Again, was part of that kind of forensic quest, right? Of kind of affixing criminality. So not only the photograph used as an index, right, but also used as a scientific kind of a conduit to be able to locate visually the marks and the traces of the criminal. But I'm also thinking about the other kinds of counter uses of the forensic and the machinic for witnessing, or for other modes in which to kind of, because there's two things, right? Because the machine always breaks down. So even the little anecdote you told us, that the CD was edited, right? To say how many bombs and then 7 comes in. But it's also obvious that the forensic trace is also in the CD because you can see where it was edited. Right? So that's where the social actors come in, the experts who have to read the forensic trace and translate that trace, because it's not legible for the ordinary person, including a judge. So for me, I think that question of mediating the medium itself, right? The person that comes in to translate, because always you will need something more than the machinic. Like people who work on, say, satellite imaging will say you couldn't see where the weapons of mass destruction were when they were pointing at Iraq. But you needed Dick Cheney to come in and say that dot over there, that's a WMD. So if you could just say, and I think this actually ties in with Upanita's question, right? Who are the many different social, it's a production of the expert and expertise that's needed beyond the machinic to actually make that trace, the forensic trace, legible. And this is just a comment thinking with, you don't have to respond to it. What I will do is I'll collect one more comment because I do see Rasel Ahmed, your hand is up. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Professor Lokaneeta. I would love to congratulate you on touching upon such a very crucial topic, because of late there has been kind of sanction on Rapid Action Battalion RAB in Bangladesh for the accusation of like extrajudicial killing. So I'm greatly interested in your topic, even though I couldn't have the opportunity to read your book. I'd love to read it. I'd love to kind of touch upon the idea of violence and criminality and state. So the understanding of punishment, according to like criminality, is kind of the kind of goal that jurisdiction or law kind of tries to pursue, right? So in this regard, like, isn't it a bit related to violence itself? Because whenever there is, for example, Nivoya case in Delhi, or a recent case of rape in Bangladesh at a university, where people started kind of protesting against the rape, and at the same time they start claiming like capital punishment for the rapist, for example. So isn't it kind of like related to how people perceive of justice or punishment itself, that it has to kind of seek some sort of revenge? and does create all these sort of pictures and then legitimate all the actions that is kind of like, as you call this, like extrajudicial killing, or like in terms of like using truth machine to like detect whether a person is lying, or like it's also kind of related to excluding the person as a criminal or as a villain, terrorist, or even as Muslim and Hindu or such and such with all these texts. So all these are kind of, I'm just a bit curious, like, did you find out, are these related to the understanding of punishment by state, by common people, and by all the kind of agencies related to the idea? Because everybody kind of probably seeks to kind of get a revenge, like capital punishment as an ultimate outcome of justice system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. So I'll just very briefly maybe respond to what Debbie you said, right? And then come to your question, which is just to say that I think one of the things that has been very important is to think about how there's a sort of an uncritical acceptance of science and expertise, right? I mean, so part of it is we know that these are contested, right? These are, I mean, one of the things when you realize, when you look at the discussions around any of these scientific techniques, right? Whether you can think about fingerprinting or DNA or bite mark analysis, to the ones that I'm talking about. I mean, there are huge debate among the scientists themselves about, how reliable they are, how valid they are, and definitely questions about their legal, validity, right? But part of it is for some reason, it also feels like, it's easier to uncritically sometimes accept the experts, right? Because there's a claim of science, right? I mean, you see it most crudely in the kind of work that I'm showing, where basically, even after there's been so much criticism of narco analysis, you can have a Delhi High Court basically saying, okay, that's the place you need to go, right? I mean, and there it's very hard to distinguish between the experts and the forensic evidence, right? Because the experts' expertise is actually linked to the legitimacy of that particular machine, right? For instance, brain, think about the BOS, I didn't get a chance to talk too much about it. The founder of BOS has a lab or a company attached to his, it's run by his son, right? And they have commercial interests in that, right? So the inability to distinguish between the machine and those who interpret the machines, right, is one of the things that needs to be looked at much more, right? So the idea that the expert is going to make the forensic evidence legible, in this case, that's why, the inability to distinguish between the two becomes so important, right? And then very quickly, because I know we're also running out of time, I think you're absolutely right that one of the reasons why judicial killings, have a long history, right, in India, in, different parts of South Asia, is precisely because of this framing, right, that basically, the criminal justice system is so corrupt or inefficient or law, right, sort of jammed, right, that basically the only way you can get to justice, right, is quick forms, right? So that torture in custody also can be just a way of showing that some action has been taken, right? I mean, you see that in the film Jai Bhim, right? It's to show that, in the process, of course, you often end up reinforcing the hierarchies that exist in society. Like you said, particular bodies, right, would be more easily disposed, right, than others, right? And you see that in the case of the UP extrajudicial killings, right? If you look, who are the people who are being targeted, right? Or those who can be framed as militants in the Northeast or elsewhere, right? So I think you're absolutely right that there is a very high acceptance, right, of state violence alongside the cultures of social violence, right? Obviously that has played a role as well in creating or strengthening cultures of impunity, right? And I think that's something we need to look at very closely as well.
So I think if there's no further questions, I mean, we could continue this conversation, but I think it's time, to let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening, Jinee. Thank you so much. I think this was a really, really interesting Q&A. And thank you for your questions, everyone, and your comments. And hope that we can have you again for the next book project and in person.
Yes. Thanks so much.